ערב טוב לכולם. אנחנו נקדיש את השעה וחצי, שקדי, הבאות, לפאנל שבעצם המטרה שלו להסתכל על פעולות הרשות בצורה די רחבה על ידי רשימה של מומחים. רגע, והוא לא צריך לדעת את זה. מה זה? אוקיי. אז עכשיו אני אעבור לאנגלית. So we're going to start this session, which is basically a panel which is focused on the actions of the Nature and Parks Authority at mostly at the scientific level, with a long-range look out to the future about what is the correct way of doing things in our very special country. I'll be chairing the session. There'll be 5 members of the panel, which I think I'll introduce afterwards, and we'll open this session with greetings from the director of the Nature and Parks Authority, Shaul.
שלום לכולם, ערב טוב. אז איך מברכים ארגון של 50 שנה, של אין סוף מטלות, של אלפי עובדים, שבאמת יש לו תפקיד מבחינתנו מהמרכזים שיש במדינת ישראל. אז אולי הדרך הטובה להתחיל זה שנת היובל בתורה, זה שנה שבה העבדים יוצאים לחופשי והקרקעות חוזרות לבעליהן. אז אולי זה זמן טוב להציע לממשלה להחזיר את הקרקעות לטבע, את בעלי החיים לשחרר. אולי זו התחלה טובה. אז באמת, רשות הטבע והגנים היום עוסקת בהרבה מאוד דברים. אני לא אדבר על תחום המורשת, שאנחנו עוסקים בו רבות, על תחום הנוף, על תחום ליווי התשתיות, על תחום מניעת הבנייה הבלתי חוקית, על תחום הפיקוח על נמלי התעופה ושדות ומעברי הגבול של ישראל. אני לא אדבר עוד הרבה מאוד תחומים שהרשות עוסקת בהם, שכל אחד מהם יש לו קשר כזה או אחר לשמירת טבע בישראל. תחום הטבע עצמו, כשאני שואל את עצמי וגם את הפקחים מסוג השיחות שאני אוהב לנהל, אני שואל אותם, תגידו לי דבר אחד שבו אפשר לשים את הדגש והטבע בישראל יישמר טוב יותר. ואתה לא יכול לרדת מ-15 מטלות, לא הצלחנו. ככל שאתה מסתכל על זה, אתה לא יכול לרדת מאכיפה, אתה לא יכול לרדת מהסברה, אתה לא יכול לרדת ממחקר. יש עוד הרבה מאוד דברים שאנחנו אמורים לעשות על מנת לשמור על הטבע בישראל. ובאמת שמסתכלים על המקרו של המדינה כולה, ישראל היא מדינה מאוד מאוד צפופה מכל בחינה שהיא. וכל מה שאומרים צפופה, הכוונה היא בסוף איום על השטחים הפתוחים. אז כולנו מכירים את השיעור גידול בישראל, 2.1%, גידול האוכלוסייה שהוא הגדול במערב. אנחנו מכירים את התשתיות האחרונות, אם זה גז, ואם זה דברים אחרים. אנחנו רוצים להיות מדינה תיירותית, כמות התיירים בישראל הולכת ועולה. אנחנו מדברים על שטחי חקלאות. החקלאות בישראל הופכת להיות ענף רציני מאוד, החקלאות הייטק. והופכת להיות יותר ויותר בבתי גידול, וכבר לא חקלאות פתוחה שהיא אינטרפייס בין השטחים הפתוחים לעירוניים. הכל מקורה, הכל בבתי רשת או בחממות. אנחנו מסתכלים על הגדלת הנחלות בפריפריה, אנחנו מסתכלים על הרכבת לאילת ועל תשתיות החשמל והחשמל הסולרי ועל תשתיות אזורי המגה תשתית של הפקת מוצרים נלווים, למשל לגז, נפט וכן הלאה. ובעצם שבשולחן שלי, אם אתם תסתכלו יום אחד על כמות האיומים, סליחה שאני אומר את זה, מדינת ישראל קטנה מדי בשביל כל האיומים האלה, צריכים להגדיל את השטח. אולי זה מתכון לאיזה דברים לא טובים, אבל אתה מסתכל כמה בקשות ודרישות יש מהממשלה קו נטוי יזמים, והכל חיובי והכל נכון. וכשאתה בא באמת להביע את דעתך בתור ארגון ממשלתי בסוגיות השונות, זה גם לא פשוט. הרי כל אחד מאיתנו, למשל, בעד אנרגיה נקייה. אנחנו לא רוצים אנרגיה מנפט. גז זה איזה מין ברירת מחדל טובה יותר, אבל עדיין גרועה. יאללה, אז איזה אנרגיה טובה לנו? שמש, רוח. אז בואו נתחיל בשמש. שמש כדי לייצר אנרגיה, צריכים שטחים עצומים של קולטים. אז כל זמן שהם על הגג של בניינים קיימים, ניחא. אבל כשאתה מתחיל לדבר על שטחים בנגב, מדובר על אלפי דונמים, שהולכים ומכוסים בקולטים הללו, זה ממש הופך להיות שטחים פתוחים כמו שאנחנו מכירים ורוצים לראות. כשאתה מדבר על אנרגיית הרוח, כשעשינו בדיקה, כמובן שהרוח בעיקר טובה בהרים, ההרים בישראל בדרך כלל נמצאים מעל קו השבר הסורי-אפריקני, שזה בדיוק הקו של הנדידה של 500 מיליארד בעלי כנף, מצד לצד כל עונה. לך עכשיו תגיד לא לאנרגיה ירוקה. אז מה, אתה רוצה לזהם את האוויר בישראל? ואם תגיד כן, הטורבינות הללו הופכות למטחנת בשר, שטוחנת את הטלפים ואת בעלי הכנף. ואנחנו באמת, כל סוגיה כזאת, דנים בה באמת לאורך זמן ולעומק העניין, ומאוד מאוד חשובה לנו עזרת המדענים ועזרת המדע פה. אנחנו צריכים באמת לדעת האם הנתונים שיש בידינו הם נכונים או לא נכונים. וגם בדברים האלה, כשאנחנו מחליטים ללכת כנגד מיזם ממשלתי, אנחנו עושים את זה. אני חושב שהארגון, יש בו אומץ רב. ראינו את זה בהצלחה האחרונה שלנו, הפנומנלית, בעצירת המיזם של פצלי השמן בשפילת יהודה. עשינו עבודה נהדרת ברט"ג, יחד עם הארגונים הסביבתיים, ה-NGOים, יחד עם המועצה האזורית, יחד עם המשרד להגנת הסביבה, ובאמת הגענו לתוצאות מדהימות. נכשלנו כישלון חרוץ בינתיים בפרויקט שבעיניי הוא הפוגעני ביותר לטבע בישראל מאז ומעולם, פרויקט הרכבת לאילת. בינתיים נכשלנו, אני עדיין מקווה שנצליח בשלבים הקטנים יותר. הייתה לנו הצלחה קטנה במועצה המקומית הר הנגב, עוד כמה שבועות יש לנו במדע המחוזית בדרום, והדברים האלה מאוד מאוד קשה לנו להוביל קו שהוא בעצם נגד פרויקט ממשלתי. כשאנחנו מסתכלים על הסיכום, אנחנו יודעים שאחרי 50 שנה של פיתוח בישראל, המקום הופך להיות צפוף יותר, הטבע נכנס למשבצות בין כבישים, רכבות, קווי חשמל, מטעים, דקלים, בתי יקב וכן הלאה וכן הלאה, והכל חשוב והכל נדרש, אבל ישראל הופכת להיות מין נייר משבצות, והתפקיד שלנו זה באמת לנסות כמה שיותר, לשמור על שטחים פתוחים, לשמור על מסדרונות אקולוגיים, ולאפשר איכשהו, לא יודע אם נצליח כל כך, אבל אנחנו מאמינים שכן, להצליח איכשהו, לשמור על הטבע בישראל טוב יותר מאשר בעבר. לשם כך אנחנו באמת צריכים את כולם. אנחנו לא יכולים לוותר על אף ארגון, ולכן שיתוף הפעולה שלנו עם כל הארגונים, אנחנו עובדים עליו קשה מאוד. ארגונים שהם אחים לנו, כמו החברה להגנת הטבע. האמת היא שהם יעלבו אם אני אגיד שהם אחים לנו, הם צריכים להגיד שהם ההורים שלנו, כי סך הכל הם יזמו את ההקמה של הרט"ג לפני 50 שנה. אבל ככה אנחנו מודים להם. אבל ארגונים של חברה אזרחית, ארגונים של סטודנטים, מגמה ירוקה וכן הלאה, ארגונים אחרים כמו קק"ל, וגם ארגונים שבטבעם לא עושים טוב לטבע, אבל שאתה רותם אותם, הם בהחלט ממזערים את הנזק, כמו צה"ל, כמו הרשות לפינוי מוקשים, כמו מע"צ, כמו כיבוי אש, כל מיני ארגונים שעובדים בשטחים הפתוחים, וחשוב מאוד שיהיו איתנו. וכאן אנחנו נמצאים כרגע באוניברסיטת בר אילן, ולכאן אני רוצה להגיד תודה רבה גם לאוניברסיטאות ולאקדמיה שמסייעת לנו מאוד בחשיבה. אני אשמח מאוד שבתקופה שלי זה יתעצם. דרך אגב, בסערת סוגריים, אני אגיד לכם שאני היום מכניס תנאי סף לכל התפקידים כמעט ברשות של לימודים אקדמיים, ומי שלא לומד לא יכול להתקבל. ובשנה האחרונה הכנסנו לתארים ראשונים פי 4 מאשר בעבר, וכבר היום, שנה שעברה, לומדים 80 מעובדי הרשות, נכנסו ללימודים בשנה אחת, השנה נרשמו כבר 90, כי אנשים מבינים שבאמת ללמוד את הבסיס באקדמיה, זה בסיס לכל עשייה נכונה בעתיד. אני מאחל לכולנו שהארגון שלנו ימשיך בדרך שהוא הלך עד היום, של מסירות, של אכפתיות, של מעורבות, של הבנה חברתית, של מקצועיות, ויחד בשיתוף פעולה עם גורמים אחרים נצליח לשמור על השטחים הפתוחים ועל הטבע בישראל. ותודה לכולכם שהשתתפתם, וחבל לי שלא הייתי בכל המושבים, אבל שמעתי שהם היו מצוינים, ועוד אקרא את הסיכומים. תודה רבה, ערב טוב, ובהזדמנות זאת, שנה טובה לכולנו.
We will start with a short presentation by the Chief Scientist of the Nature and Parks Authority, Dr. Yoshua Shkedi. And the purpose of this is to give you an overview of the way the Nature and Parks Authority operates professionally. And this will be the basis on which we will build the panel's discussion.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for coming. We are 50, and like all the 50 years old people or organization, we are doing some evaluations. We are going to study what we are doing. And for that, we have a distinguished guest from abroad that will be presented later. And together with Israeli expert, we're trying to evaluate our activities. The IMPA is doing it every 50 years. So we are 50. So about 50 years ago, Avraham Yoffe, the late first general manager, he asked for a professor from, I don't remember where, his name is Scott. He came to Israel, he did some evaluation, he gave us advice, and only after 50 years, we repeated the process. I can understand why, because it's a tough process, and I'm not going to do it again, because it was a tough week, but later on in the panel, you will see what we were doing. Unfortunately, well, thank you guys for coming. We have 2 experts from abroad. Unfortunately, 3 declined to come partially because of the war, and I'm sorry about that, but it's like in football. You have the game with the players that you have. So these are the players that we have, and thank you very much for coming to Israel, despite the war and despite everything. I will try to rush. In the next 15 minutes, I will skim over our philosophy, and after that, we will talk about the findings of the distinguished panel. Why isn't it moving? Okay. So this is the first and most important slide for me. This is our main philosophy. The first thing that we are doing is habitat protection. You can call it landscape, you can call it whatever you like, you can call it ecosystem, but this is the main thing. As long as you keep the ecosystem or the habitats represented in nature reserve, big ones, so they keep big populations, and connected, so migration will take place, and we think that this will give the umbrella that you see on the corner, that all the species will find their habitats within the protected areas. All the countries in the world fail to do that. And when they fail to do that, they have problems. And the problems are with species that are endangered or outbreaking. I will talk about that in a minute. Populations are too big, or invasive that we are bringing them from other countries. So if we keep the habitats protected well, usually we don't have to deal with species. And this is true both in the marine and the terrestrial environment. We have many threats to nature in Israel. I'm not going to list all of them, but the main ones are, as you heard from Dan in the morning, habitat destruction, fragmentation. On top of that, we have fire, pollution, invasive species, outbreaking species, and of course, illegal use of resources, mainly poaching, but there are other logging, etc. Israel is unique. Dotan showed you this picture in the last session, but not all of you have been here. So Israel is kind of here in the middle, or it's Jerusalem in the middle, but Israel is connecting Eurasia and Africa. And as you can see on the slide that you have 4 different bioregions, and you can imagine yourself taking your helicopter, going from En-Gedi, it's tropical, and then you go to the desert, and then you go to Irano-Turanian or the Persian, and then you land, say, next to Jerusalem. You are crossing 4 major bioregions in a flight of less than 20 minutes. if your helicopter is good enough. It is amazing. It doesn't happen in many other places in the world. And because of that, we are diverse in ecosystems. The ecosystems were mapped, as Dotan showed you in the last session, based on expert opinion. We are doing more and more detailed mapping of ecosystems, mainly in the desert. I'm not going into the details. It's been done these days by Yochai Carmel, the SPNI, and others. Because of this diversity, you can see on the landscape diversity of Israel, and I took the liberty to show you just some pictures. I didn't take any of the pictures. I'm a lousy photographer, but other people, and thank you for that, for giving me the pictures. This is from the Hermon to Engedi and the Oasis. We see herbaceous Bata. We have our beautiful desert, and well, I'm a desert person, so for me, the desert in Israel is one of the most beautiful parts in Israel and maybe in the world. And this landscape, diverse landscape leads to a diverse species diversity. So we are really privileged to have different habitats, very diverse, different landscape, and a lot of species. I think it's a miracle that with all the development that we have in Israel, the species diversity is relatively high. Again, in the last session, Dotan was showing that we make the ecosystem, and we want it to be represented, and we know what ecosystems are better represented than others in protected areas, and we are doing our best to increase the representation of different ecosystems in nature reserves. We know that it is not good enough, and that is why Eli Sadot, my colleague, my teacher, that is sitting here, and I came out with the corridors a map. It was done in 2000, and then Dotan refined it to match what is going on today. So we know that not everything is protected within nature reserves, so we know that we need corridors to let species to move and migrate from one place to another and better protect the different ecosystems. It's not perfect, but together with the reserves and the corridors, we think we're doing better. But if you look into the history, people are living in Israel for many years. In the last 10,000 years, the utilization of habitat is extremely extremely heavy, with fire, with logging, with hunting, etc. And the ancient people in this country use the landscape all the time, but not only in the past. This is just an example of another use of ecosystem in Israel, together and with overlap with nature reserves, that we have firing zone in nature reserves. It's not always negative, but you can imagine that it creates some problems, that nature reserve and firing zone not always live well together. And given the history and the present and the future, management is necessary. We cannot just say hands off, don't touch, not the populations, don't touch the reserves. You have to do management. And fortunately enough, in Israel, it is less complicated than in Kenya. And when we are saying that we want to do something, we put everything on the table, and we don't have veto from the Lion Department, as Dan described this morning. Don't do that. So we are a bit in a better condition. But we know they have to do active management. What we're doing, we try to do adaptive management. It's easier said than done, but we have no default. It is either can be hands-off or 100% intervention. 100% is we are taking a tractor, we are building a habitat. And you heard Avi Uzan's talk 2 hours ago. We just build new habitats if it is necessary. So we don't say no to anything. Management as much as needed. For every type of biome, and Avi gave his talk about the Mediterranean. So we gather knowledge, we point to the threats, and then we have needed management. For example, in the Mediterranean is grazing, fuel or fire breaks, and thinning of the maquis. You can see here, for example, this is an experiment we did together with the local people. The history is extremely interesting, but I'm not going to repeat it now. That in the right-hand side, we did some thinning. On the left-hand side, we did control. We did nothing. There are cows on both sides. Here, with the thinning management, we find very high and very good species diversity, while in the left side, even though we have grazing, we find almost nothing. So we know what to do, and we know that if we are not doing management, we get fire. This is a picture, I think, from the Carmel. And you can see that we are using grazing, and I hope that the light is good enough that you see the difference between the two sides. So we use a grazing as a management tool. It's not always as effective as you see here, but we try. So we have rules for management in different biomes. I'm not going into the details because I don't like to take too much time from the distinguished panel. So we know what we're doing in the desert. We know what we're doing with in the sand dunes. Here, thanks to Pua, I don't see her wave. Oh, she's not here. Oh, here she is, that we are doing a lot of work with her and with Yaron Ziv in the Western Negev and other people that we are going for active and adaptive management, and we are managing, and we are trying to find a way, for example, for the sand dunes to hold the psamophilic species. I would like to have a word on the Mediterranean Sea. We started to work on the Mediterranean Sea too late. Eli Sadot and Reuven Ortal many years ago have a small plan, but there is no policy behind it. Today we have a policy, and we are going forward to make sure that we'll have big reserves, and we are not going to repeat the same mistakes that we did on the terrestrial area. So we have big reserves that represent the ecosystem, so it's going from the coastline up to the Israeli waters, and that is what we're doing. Big reserves that are represented, and we think and we believe that it's going to cover the biodiversity of Israel. The main thing that is missing here yet, and I'm sorry that there's no people from the Ministry of Agriculture here, I think, is that Echad is one, and he's hiding and but he's not responsible for that. The fisheries management and policy is absolutely lacking in the Mediterranean Sea. This is a black dot on the Israeli policy, but the IMPA is not responsible for fisheries, unfortunately. I have no time to talk about the Red Sea. Sorry for the guys from Eilat. I cannot even start talking about the Red Sea because it's too complicated, but we are doing a lot of management and a lot of activities over there. I would like to elaborate a bit about wetland management, because I think in this point, the IMPA proved that when it has the law, and we change with many people, with many organizations, the law was changed in 2004, so nature is now eligible to take water. It's not just there to supply the water, but to accept the water. Right now, the government is giving us money to take care of wetlands, and because of that, we are doing wonders. We are getting more and more water to the nature reserves, especially in this year, these 10 years that was relatively dry. The amount of water within the reserves increased in many places by doubled, in other places less, but the amount of water we get in the reserves is increasing, and this is because of all kinds of tricks that we are doing together with the Ministry or the Water Authority and the Ministry of Environment. And we are doing a lot of engineering in order to rehabilitate wetlands and to get the species and the habitats back. And now I'm going to species. I feel a bit strong here talking about endangered species, especially about the plants, because I think here we worked right. We have a red book of the endangered plant species. Avi Shmida, that got a reward here in this afternoon, was one of the authors. The other author sits here in the back, Gadi Polak and Ori Fragman. And together we have a red book of species. On top of that, we build a strategy. And on the strategy, we have plans to do both in the fields and in the reserves and in situ and ex situ, and we have on top of that a group of scientists that are sitting next to us and giving us advice. We take the liberty to say no sometimes, because it is our responsibility. But I think that from top to bottom, it is relatively dealt rationally, even though we still have criticism and we listen to the criticism. We have to build strategies like that with other issues like the endangered animals, and I will leave this area. We are dealing a lot with trying to lower the conflict between nature and agriculture, because we see it everywhere. In this picture with the dead cormorant is unfortunately a common sight in Israel, but we are still making progress together with the Ministry of Agriculture and the fishermen. And one of the major problems that we are not dealing well yet is with the outbreaking populations. Israel is not a clean country, and I'm not talking about the politics, I'm talking about what is happening outside in the open landscapes. We find that too many carcasses of dead animals, and because of that there is a growth of jackals, foxes, wild boars, and others eating also the agricultural products. And it's a major problem, but with sanitation, and we are doing ourselves a lot of sanitation, the INPA is cleaning the country with a truck, moving carcasses from place to place. Amazing. This is not our job, and now we are pushing our job to others to do their part. And I hope we'll be successful, because clean Israel is going, the nature in clean Israel is going to be much better than what we see today. Another major problem is the invading species. All of you know about that. There's so many invading species in Israel. We are better, we try to minimize the number of new species that might be invaders by using CITES and with the help of Ministry of Agriculture, but it's still one part. But we have major problem in fighting with the local species, and we're investing plenty of time and money fighting local species like the Acacia saligna and others that invade Israel, and they're taking beautiful habitats, and this is on the expense on the local ones. I'm not going to elaborate on the monitoring, except of saying that because we didn't have a good enough overview of what is going in the entire open landscape in Israel, including area that is managed by the JNF or Keren Kayemet, and by us, we built a new body that is called the Ma'arag, and the Ma'arag, its main object is to produce statute of nature reports based on monitoring. And we are doing the monitoring based on, we're dissecting the area based on threats. So we know what the threats are in different parts of the country. We have monitoring plan, and together, the Ministry of Environment, JNF, ourselves, the Israel Academy of Science, and many scientists that help us, Avi Pervolotsky here is one of them. We are trying to do a national monitoring, and I think, and both on terrestrial area and in sea, together in collaboration with other organizations, and we will have a national monitoring plan that is partially already working. Not everywhere, not everything that we do, but this is working. I'm not going to talk about research, but saying that right now I don't have enough resources to establish a good research programs for many years. I'm fiddling with the money because all of the other missions that we have. And of course, all of that has to go into databases, and we are working as we speak on database that will be open to everybody, to the public, because the data that we have is a public domain, and part of it is presented on BioGIS that many of the Israelis know. This data can be you write badges and you get data directly from the internet. We work a lot of other organizations. Last year, we have a meeting that was concentrated on cooperation, so I'm not going to elaborate again on that. But we are working a lot with local organizations, ministries, NGOs, for example, the SPNI and others. And we are working together with overseas organizations in a mutual project, basically on, with the EU money. Before I finish, I would like to thank my, this is a partial picture of my team, and I would like to thank them individually, but there are too many, and this is only a part of the team. I have a very good team of ecologists. You guys saw them on the way. They are spread from north to south, and some of them are in the department in Jerusalem. Don't try to find yourself. This is an old picture. No, I'm joking. And I would like to acknowledge all the INPA, all the National Parks Authority employees, because the ideas and the philosophy that we have today is based on knowledge accumulated with a lot of attention, a lot of work, and a lot of love from our employees for many years. And I would like to have a special thank to Avi Pervolotsky, that is my personal helper for many years. I cannot describe it in any other way. And Galvin, that created, or helped me to create this presentation. Before I thank you for your listening, I would like to have some words on the mission that we have now. We decided to evaluate ourselves. I was in contact in the last year with a few scientists. A few of them, many agreed in the beginning, and then everybody has his own personal, this is kind of a fate. Anyhow, many declined on the way, and eventually we have 5 people to come from overseas. 3 of them declined at the last minute, partially because of the war and others. So we have 2 people on our team, and as the team was a bit too small, I asked 3 local scientists, 2 of them are here, to join the group. There are Tamar Dayan from University of Tel-Aviv, that you all know, Yochal Carmel from the Technion, that you all know, and Avi Pervolotsky. This is the third time I mention his name. What can I say? He joined. They joined forces, and we were covering the country in 3 days, from the Arava to the Machtesh Katan, the small crater, Nachal Tzin, the Masada, just for some Yiddishkeit, and the Btecha, and the Sea of Galilee, Gamla, the Hula Reserve, Carmel, mainly looking at Mediterranean Maki management, the coastal area, the Sea Turtles Rescue Center, and the small reserves in the Sharon. And we asked the distinguished panel to have their opinion on what we are doing. Tomorrow they're all going to sit down and write a report, especially my friends from abroad, and they're going to work hard tomorrow. I don't know if I tell you, you have a room here that separates from all the others. You have to write, other than Paulus talk. And with that report, I believe that first it will be published naturally, and we hope that we can use it in order to improve our activities in the next 10 years, because in the next 10 years, a mission like that, I believe, is not going to be created. Thank you much. Thank you very much for your listening. And please, David, run the show.
Thank you, Shkedi. I will ask the panel to come up. I'm not going to read your names out and then you come up one by one, because it will look like a basketball game. So why don't you just come up here? And Shkedi has already introduced the Israeli side. except you didn't introduce Dan Alon Rothschild. Okay, so Yochai Carmel couldn't make it to the panel, and we have Alon Rothschild to, I guess, to substitute, right? What? What? Alon Rothschild is on the panel. Okay, so. So to some of you who didn't attend before, our two guests from abroad are, maybe I should actually, I'll go through everybody in terms of their specialties, if I can figure it out. So that we'll know with who we're dealing. So the first person on this panel is Christian Schlatter from Switzerland. And although he's a mayor now, he was very strong, right? Is that correct? Or yeah, so he was very strongly involved with driving the establishment of the nature protection system in Switzerland, which is quite recent, right? And I think you also dealt with ecosystem services and issues like that, right? So that's more or less his background. Dan Rubenstein is a professor at Princeton. He does mostly behavioral ecology with a lot of connotations to conservation, many places in the world, works mostly on equids, but not only. Then we have Professor Tamar Dayan from Tel-Aviv University. Tamar, what do? You do everything. You do, yeah, okay, that's general enough, right? So you don't do fish. She doesn't do fish, okay, but everything she does, there's always a touch of conservation issues that she deals with. Avi Pervolosky from the Vulcani Institute. Yeah, right, Shkedi's helper. I would call it Shkedi's father. Well, that's Eli Sadot. Boy, you got a strange family. Anyhow, Avi is I guess a range ecologist, working mostly on Mediterranean habitat and plant-animal interactions. And last but not least is Alon Rothschild. He's from the Israel Society for Protection of Nature. And I guess he represents our NGO aspect of things. Okay? All right, so let's get going. And I do want to thank Christian and Dan, I mean, who braved it out. They decided they were going to come before the war was over. So you get a bronze star, I guess. So I want to start off with a more general question. And this general question is really, is Israel unique, conservation-wise? Are our problems different from the ones you encounter in the past? Now, I'll start with you, Christian, because I was at your talk, and you showed us how similar we are to Switzerland. By the way, you may not know this, but I'm the director of the Swiss Institute. And it sits in the Negev Desert. So because everybody's laughing here, it's not the same, okay? So Switzerland and Israel are different, and so I'm really seriously, you said there are a lot of similarities, but are the conservation issues here different? Is there anything that you saw around here that you said, boy, I wish I didn't have this kind of problem?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a bit tricky to start, but I will try nevertheless. I was the first time in Israel. We have a very biased reporting, and on all levels, of course, as you can imagine. And I must say, I am overwhelmed with what I saw, and I don't say that because I want to be in a good light in front of you, but because I really have this impression, and I was really hard trying to scratch on the surface, on the facade of INPA, to see if there's something really big behind it and something really strange in the world of nature conservation. But all the contacts in 3 days, you cannot do a very lot, especially if you're driven by the first slave driver of the organization, which is Kelly. But anyway, I had some opportunities to speak to other people from other organizations, and they all confirmed my impression, which is a very positive one. And it is a very positive one because you are all in a very difficult setting. Israel is not the easiest place to live in, probably, in all terms, for me especially climatic, but you have some other points. And I see that so many impressive people are working here in this organization, INPA, and I think those are the real strong points. And only afterwards, I think, I'm curious more to see into the projects in detail, which means to think about ecology, which was, of course, basically the job of Dan, because he's far better than I am. I see that there are some small gaps maybe, or some things which could be elaborated a little bit more, but that's always the case. And what I think, to bring it to the point and to come to a conclusion, I think what you guys do here is fantastic, because you do things and you don't wait until you have all the evidence and all the 0.001 significance levels of all the details and all the scientific theories. But you start doing, you start learning, you have your criticizing loops, you have a very, very open culture within the organization, but also with major players outside the organization, which is very helpful, and especially you're not afraid of committing mistakes. And I think that's the way to go forward. You can be sure in nature conservation, with all the number of species you're trying to protect and all the ecosystems and habitats, you will commit suicides in certain cases, that's for sure. But in the whole, I have a very, very positive picture of your organization, and especially of your work and of the staff behind it.
No, I'm not done with you. No, my question was really I totally agree with you. Okay, the personnel and the thinking is good. Was there anything in terms of the natural land of Israel and the anthropogenic impact on it that made you think to yourself, boy, I'm glad I don't have to deal with this problem?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, okay. So, okay, spit it out.
Maybe he's a politician.
Yeah. Well, no one here votes for you anyhow.
Unfortunately. No, to be serious, I think the most obvious thing is the border, and the border question, and your neighbors, and your difficult situation with the neighbors. And that's something we didn't really feel directly, but it was quite obvious when you go along the Ridge Valley, or when you go to the Golan Heights or whatever. It is there, and it's kind of a feeling. And when you come to ask about cooperations across transboundary cooperation, which I'm very much used to because we organize ourselves, of course, across the border, it comes very, very fast to a stop, out of very obvious reasons, of course. And that's something I think is problematic, especially for a thematic like nature conservation, which doesn't stop on the border. Mm-hmm. That was one thing. And the other thing was land use. And I think land use has, in the short time I was here, let's say 4 aspects. The one is agriculture, which is very dominant, which is very important, very strong, also very powerful. The second one is forestry. I have not a very detailed picture because it is somehow a bit complicated for a Swiss guy to make a comparison between a Swiss forest and the Israeli forest, of course. But I saw many plantations, and it reminds me of all the things we did in Switzerland with the plantations in 100 or 150 years ago, which are still today obvious in the landscape. And I think that's a point which can be dealt in a way or in another way. Third point, of course, settlements. You are in a rocketing, growing area, 2% of population growth a year. We had 1% during the last 5 years. It came to an abrupt halt because we had a referendum on it. You can't do that in Israel. And you have to deal in a way or in another way with the situation, and it's really difficult. And we had a short insight between the sea turtle station, which name I don't remember, but you all know, and coming here, and it is overwhelming, the amount of settlement and people and social activities. And the last one probably is kind of the tourism also. And again, I have not a direct insight, but it was the feeling when we walked along the beaches there in the turtle station, that there is quite a pressure on it, and it doesn't facilitate your life. And I suppose it is somehow another pressure which is important. So those 4 points I want to underline especially, and I think when it comes to agriculture and to forestry, those are probably the two main things you can really work on and improve the situation.
Thank you. I actually would, during the break, I was sitting with Dan, and I asked him the same question, and he said, no, it's nothing unique. And then I thought for a moment, he's from New Jersey, so it's sort of, you know, it looks to him it's pretty much the same problems. But Dan, is there anything, again, it's sort of the same thing, is there anything you looked at and said, my God, I wish I'm lucky I don't have to deal with this kind of stuff?
I think there are many similarities. I'll start there and then we'll get to the differences. So, wildlife does what it wants to do. Everywhere in the world. It has its own habitats that it chooses, it has its own movement patterns, and that leads to conflict. It's acute in Israel because people are packed in amongst each other, and the gaps in the space between where people are, where the reserves are one atop the other. So the freedom to deal with letting animals extend themselves, they are bumping into people all the time. That's number one. Number two is people do what they want to do, which is generally to degrade the landscape for their own benefit. As Paolo is going to talk about tomorrow, the issues of externalities. Environment and resources don't factor into equations in economics because the goods and services are given and you're looking at the marginal values of the use around the edges. And so the bad things are dumped onto the environment. And as Skedi was talking about, or as the Director General was talking about through the translation from Skedi, everybody wants to be green. We need wind power, we need solar power, and if it's on the roof of a house, that's okay. But if you're at the center of a flyway for all the migrating birds in the world, do you have the right to put up towers to get wind power and destroy the hawks and the other birds? Do you want to have farms, acres upon acres in the desert to catch solar? What impact is that going to have? In the US, we have plenty of space, even in New Jersey, which is small. And there are already degraded lands where people will put the wind farms and the solar towers. And we'll often put them far enough offshore where they won't affect the birds. And there are issues with all of these things, but we have space, and we, if we're enlightened, can manage that space in a way. But the problems are the same. We're trading off one set of benefits against another set of costs, and usually biodiversity in the environment suffers as we try to solve other problems. In Israel, everything is on top of each other. The Negev was only 2 hours away from Jerusalem. It's very, very close, and so it's out of sight, out of mind until a problem develops. The same with the railroad that we were talking about when we went down there to visit. So there are very many similarities, but the acuteness of scale is one of the really big differences. You talk about boundaries. I work in Kenya. Kenya's at war with Somalia. Now, you probably don't realize that, but it leads to all sorts of problems with hostage taking and killing of random people on the coast. But when I try to take students from my university, the parents go, how can you go to Kenya? It's at war. There are bad things happening. Well, yes, that's true, but it's this distance between Chicago and New York. And if it's a murder in Chicago, would you not come to New York on holiday? If I say that to the parents, they go, it's not the same. Well, it is exactly the same. And the problem is that, again, of scale. That there's war and there's violence taking place on the Sudanese border, it's taking place on the Somali border. There are border issues with Tanzania, but they're minor because the ecosystems are connected, the Serengeti Masai Mara ecosystem. So again, it's an issue of scale. Differences, there are some, and they emerge, I think, depending on what I understand to be the mandate of the Nature Reserve Society. You manage the reserves, is that correct? Are you responsible for maintaining all the wildlife in the country? Okay, because in Kenya, the Kenya Wildlife Service has two remits. One, they manage the wildlife for the government because the people do not own the wildlife. Very different from South Africa. If you've got wildlife on your land, you own it, you can manage it, you can shoot it, you can sell it, you can trade it, you can do anything you want. Kenya, the government owns all the wildlife and they entrust it to the Kenya Wildlife Service. And this is where there's a paradox, and I don't know whether, it's something we should explore, but I don't know whether there is a difference or a similarity here. Kenya's management through the Wildlife Service is supposed to be of all the wildlife on all the land, but they actually only control the national parks, which is 25% of the country, but as I talked about this morning, 70% of the wildlife is on private land. And they're not sure what to do about that. Their mandate, in theory, goes that far, but it depends on the director. So when Richard Leakey was director, he kept all the resources inside the parks. And so he believed in island Africa. When Jonah or David Western took over, he tried to connect to the people, and he tried to devolve control out to wildlife fora and give local control of the wildlife because he really believed that the Kenya Wildlife Service should be supporting and protecting all the wildlife on all the lands. And I don't know whether your remit is different from Kenya's remit or not, but that's going to have a huge impact and something I hope we talk about when we talk about fisheries, for example. Do you want to change the fishery laws, protecting all the wildlife, working with the agriculture department, or do you want to have your protected areas and control the rights of fishermen in those areas? Very different strategies and tactics depending on what your remit is. So those are some of the similarities and differences that I think we should talk about.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Okay, I'm going to continue with the same question. We're short on time, so really, with the Israeli members of the panel, very short. Alon, what do you think is really bad about nature protection in Israel? Not the whole list. We don't have time.
So I'll start shortly with to tell you what I did this morning. It's very interesting. At 6:30 in the morning, I was at Hatzerim Air Force Base, and I watched some 15 bustards, chubarot, very rare species of a bird. And then we went to clean all the garbage that the base used to dump for decades in these territories. The bustards, the entire population of the bustards in Israel comes to Hatzerim inside an army base each year. And if the base wants them to live, they will live. And if the base doesn't want them to live or ignores them, they're going to die. This is an army base, it's not a nature reserve. And I think this sums up the main gap that I identified today in nature conservation. The NPA invests most of its resources today within its own islands, within the nature reserve. And to my opinion, it does it between good and excellent, but the difference, the gap between good and excellent is not that important to my view. And we need to start going outside the reserves and try to invest more resources outside. Now, the cost-benefit ratio of something that you can do outside a reserve, it might be a very minor thing, but still it's going to have a huge impact in contrast to a very complicated management plan on a reserve which is already managed and is doing quite okay. Now, the gap today between the status of nature inside reserves and outside reserves on natural habitats is huge. And the main problem is the strategy and the legislation. Israel is obligated to manage and to have a national strategic action plan to manage its nature according to the CBD and the OECD. and is not doing it. For the past 5 years, we've been waiting for the Ministry of Environment to take this flag and start to move it forward. And me personally, I'm not going to wait much longer. We are on the sure path of missing the CBD targets. And to my opinion, the NPA should not wait for the Ministry of Environment, and the NPA should go and take this flag and put the necessary resources to have the right legislation and the right action plan, and start to manifest it outside the reserves to mainstream biodiversity in all different entities like the IDF that I was talking about earlier. At the moment, at the Ministry of Environment, I'm very sorry to say it, but this is my own observation after a few years of trying. There is no political will, there is no professional capacity to manifest this necessary action plan, and I think that the NPA should take this flag and move it forward, because otherwise we're going to stay in the same loop that we've been in for the past 5 to 10 years. I think it's time for the NPA to take it forward.
Okay, thank you, Alon. Okay, so now from the Israeli science point of view, Tamar?
Same question?
Yeah, can you answer like Rafur?
אלון הוא גם ישראלי.
What?
אלון הוא גם ישראלי.
No, I'm talking from the academia, like the academic standpoint. Academics are supposed to be objective. Alon's not supposed to be objective.
First, I do agree with Alon that biodiversity needs to be mainstreamed, and it's really not clear, there's Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a little bit like the NPA, but there's also a Ministry of Environmental Protection, and where the responsibility lies between the two, but definitely this needs to be mainstreamed, I think. And I will say that Shkedi was one of the people to push originally over a decade ago for a national action plan, biodiversity action plan, and it definitely needs to be moved ahead either by the NPA or by the ministry and the NPA. I think on the whole, I think there's been huge progress in the NPA's dealing with its professional duties, and I think I agree with Shkedi. I think there's really an excellent team now that works together and is very professional and is already very confident at what it does, and is very, very active and does very, very active management. And what I would like to see more and more as a scientist, and I appreciate the fact that you don't have enough research budget. Shaul, maybe you should take this responsibility on your shoulders, but I would like to see a little more action going on that's based on actual long-term research on formulating scientific questions and dealing with them, on diverse taxa rather than indicators that we're not always sure what they're indicating, or surrogates that we're not always sure what they're surrogates for. I think there's a little too much gut feeling and rules of thumb often. And my guess is that in most of its actions, the NPA is correct. It's not that I feel that there's a major catastrophe going on and we're not dealing with it, but I think the organization is now strong enough and professional enough to improve the resolution of the results that it gets on freshwater, for example, rehabilitating habitats and so on, to be able to see what actually happens when we take a lot of proactive conservation steps. I think you do well to forge a stronger working relationship with academia on some sort of structured basis. This would be a good challenge for the next decade. And one thing that I really feel is not well taken care of, and I know that you guys are aware of it, but it's something that needs to be pushed ahead, because and Dan already, you referred to it, or was it Christian? The fact that a lot of people are using the open landscapes as tourism, for recreation, for field trips, for barbecues and whatever. And visitor pressure in a lot of ways in the nature reserve, in the open landscapes, in camping grounds where the rules are not clear as to the number of visitors that can stay over, the number of visitors that can come to the nature reserves on the peak seasons, their impact on the nature reserves and so on. There's a beginning, but there's still a huge amount of work and management work to deal with this challenge.
Yeah, you assume correctly. You must be a scientist.
First of all, I would like to join the compliments, especially made by Alon, but other participants here. I think the NPA, especially from the scientific point of view, has made a huge progress. And I look on these issues over almost 40 years. And there was a session today here where people from the NPA presented their professional work, and for me it was like unthinkable achievement compared to what was done in this organization when Eli Sadot was young. No comparison whatsoever. However, this means that we are coming close to a road cross where you cannot be anymore very professional and do so many things. And if you look on what the daily work of a biologist, ecologist in the NPA is basically running after the tail. They don't have the time to do anything in a more professional way. They do not read literature, they have too many things on the table, which means that the prioritization process is not good enough. And it relates to the fact that this organization has already taken too many things upon itself. In general as an organization, and in particular in the scientific division. And it calls to a reform in thinking. And I'll stop here.
Okay, so let me sum this up, what we were hearing here. We were hearing problems with acute problems of borders, anthropogenic pressure in the form of hikers and tourists, land use, and in terms of the ability of the Nature and Parks Authority to deal with the wide range of scientific issues with the manpower they have. Given this, here's the next question. Is the current, yeah?
I'm not exactly sure about how contradictory this panel should be, but I have nevertheless a comment towards Alon, which I agree in principle very much that it is about high noon to create a biodiversity strategy. But I would like to express my warnings that this shouldn't be done by ANPA on its own, because it needs the ministry. It's something the politic needs to stand behind. That's the experience we had in Switzerland, and basically the process of doing it was 4 or 5 years of lobbying after having 10 years of lobbying in the parliament already, and to make an awareness in the heads of the ministers, and then to get this task, now let's go and now let's have a strategy. Because if you do it on your own, you certainly will end up with a much better quality, but you don't have the hold back from the politics.
Interesting point. So the next stage over here now, we'll go back to the actual policies, and right now the NPA is putting most of its emphasis into trying to declare nature reserves, taking care of the ecosystems, rather than focusing on individual species rehabilitation or providing for the individual species. Do you agree that this policy, is this a correct policy, given everything we've talked about up to now, the scale we're talking about in Israel, the pressures, is this a correct policy? Because in one way, I could actually tell you, look, you know, there's a area biodiversity curve. Your reserves are small. I mean, you're going to fight for a lot of small reserves, but you're not going to have any wildlife in them because they're all too small unless you manage them intensively. So this is the question. That's the devil's advocate, Avi. You just do plants, right?
I'll say two things, as short as I can. One, I don't see it feasible that there will be many more reserves in Israel, significant reserves, whatsoever, unless the reform that Yoav Sagir mentioned earlier here, that some of the agricultural land will be converted into reserve.
Let me rephrase my question. I'm talking mostly about actually not only that, but also the issue of ecosystem management versus species specific. Okay, sorry, good.
I think you changed the question in between.
Maybe so. I'm not trying to make your life easy.
Okay, so I'll stick to my beginning.
Okay, that's fine.
First of all, I don't think that we can have more reserves. That's period one. But secondly, and I think Alon mentioned it in a different way, our nature is not only in the reserves. And the interrelationship between reserves here in this country, in opposed, say, to other countries larger, nature is divided between reserves, forests, agriculture, and some other open landscape. And the real secret is how to manage it within this complex environment, and understanding that forest in Israel is part of nature, and vice versa. And I think in this respect, the NPA, in terms of conceptual thinking, has a way to go. And this is number one. And secondly, I think, is that this means that we have to deal with different organizations and people, and a lot of this has been done lately by the NPA very nicely. There is more room to do that. Cooperation, mutual convincing, understanding, compromising. There is some room to go on. There is nothing, I didn't say anything about ecosystem management because I didn't understand your question in the beginning. You want me to continue?
Did you understand it later on?
Yeah, differently. But
well, the question now is, should the Nature Reserve Authority put bigger emphasis on ecosystem management, managing these areas at the ecosystem level, or trying to manage individual species?
If this is the question, I'm sorry that I misinterpreted it. I don't think that nature conservation equals to species management. This is a very narrow perspective of the issue. And the NPA is successful in managing some of the species nicely, but this is not nature conservation.
So again, I'm going to take the devil's advocate, and then I want everybody here to respond. We look at this map that Shkedi and Sadot made at the time, and it's a corridor map, okay? Now, we all know, if you look at this map, that the corridors are larger than the reserves. They're wider than the reserves, okay? Now, it's a matter of semantics, but is there something, when we look at this map and we look at these things that he designed, which will actually, if this is achieved, will be an unbelievable contribution to conservation in Israel. But is Israel really a series of corridors? Because of the scale we're looking at, is Israel a series of corridors? What?
What are the corridors? It's a combination of some reserves, forest, agricultural land, and some other things. Mm-hmm. And it will be the same in the future. So if you want to apply ecosystem management to this concept, you have to do it with the other partners. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole issue here. It's not in their hand. They can initiate.
I'm not talking about the cooperation. I'm talking about the concept. Okay?
The concept is the only one that
I'm talking about the species area curve. Given, this is a scientific question. Given the size of these reserves, how would they be best maintained? By trying to provide for individual species, or by taking a more holistic approach? Yeah, Alon. I'm sorry.
A sentence.
A sentence, go ahead.
I don't believe in these scientific concepts.
Oh, okay.
I don't believe in these curves in our reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's nonsense. It's nonsense.
Okay.
Nature is not only part of the reserve, it's all over. It's a nonsense.
Okay.
For the sake of the panel.
Okay.
I want to follow up on Avi's approach. I think that the question is not whether we can manage nature on species approach or ecosystem approach. We have to manage the ecosystems on a human and organizational management approach. Because the NPA probably, if it wants to be successful in managing a very complex land use system, it has to bring on some other disciplines and not life science, rather than psychologists, stakeholder engagement experts, dialogue experts. That's what we need in order to negotiate a very complex land use scenario in which you have a small reserve next to an army base, next to a JNF forest, next to an agricultural land, etc., etc. So I agree with Avi that the whole human perspective, behavioral interface is the key element that we have to try and break down, using maybe approaches which are not scientific, but maybe more social sciences or behavioral sciences.
Come on, we've been writing.
Sure. These tiny or these small reserves are embedded within a landscape. So what we really need is landscape level management on the scale of Israel. And this means, and I agree with Avi, it's looking outside and looking at patterns of biodiversity in different landscapes and how they interact with each other and how they can be managed to promote biodiversity, and how would that affect agriculture in this place, or how would that affect forestry, and how would those affect the natural areas. This is a huge, huge challenge, and it can't be dealt with only at the large mammal or large birds level. It needs to go down to the majority of living things in terrestrial realm, which is arthropods also. And we still have a lot to understand, and I think this is really a big challenge. This doesn't mean that the species level approach was wrong, and I'm actually happy with the reintroductions having been made, but I think we really need to try to understand how to do landscape level management in Israel in cooperation with other organizations. My feeling is that the NPA has made great steps in this direction also in recent years, but simply the challenge is huge, so there's still a huge amount of work to be done.
Okay. So this sort of moves me into the next question, okay? Because you want to say something? Absolutely. Okay.
So, from what I gather, the corridors came from analysis of the data that had been accumulating on gazelles and other animals, correct?
No, the corridors, well,
some of them had to do with where the animals were, and then you connected the dots on where they were likely to go. So a lot of the corridors emerge from the patterns that you find with different species. They cross out of the reserves, they move across agricultural systems, forest systems. So you're right that we need to connect the dots if the landscapes are going, if the corridors are going to become effective tools to prevent the issues of, small areas and the island biogeography limits that come to individual species. But the key to understanding that is that you need to build networks and partnerships, because other people own some of this land, like the military, like the JNF, like the agriculture. So we went on our tour to a 10-hectare reserve that was very tiny, but it had 40 endangered species of plants and 14 endemics in its 10 hectares. What was striking is you'd say, but it's so small, it costs a lot of money to manage it. 2,000 to 3,000 people visit that reserve on the weekends. There's your human element. People are defining it as important for whatever reason, and yet it's embedded in the landscape. And we then heard that Functionally, it may not function very well because the bees can't get from this reserve to that reserve to that reserve. But we know from Claire Kremen's work that if you leave a few 10 meters of weeds on a farmer's field, the bees will hop and move across that landscape. So by working with the partners, the functionality of the corridor emerges, and we move away from this question of individual species. We move away from the questions of restrictions associated with small areas that have all the island biogeographic patterns, but it requires active management. Nothing happens passively and nothing happens for free. It requires active management to say, work with the farmers to leave some woodlots, work with the farmers to leave some weed patches, so that we can get the pollination, so that we can get the ecosystem services. It takes active management. And what we were seeing in our discussion was, should we bring livestock back into the equation? Should we work with the farmers to make these things functional? If you heard my talk, clearly I fall into that second camp, that active management is the only way these landscapes are going to work. And sometimes the hook is a charismatic mega species that brings in resources to pay for it. But the key is that the problem that threatens the species can become the solution if you work with the human element. So social science is just as much science as natural science, and there are good social scientists out there that understand irrational behavior, motivation, incentives that move people to act in ways that you want, just like you'd work with the landscape to manipulate it and the tools at your disposal to get it to work the way you want.
So now you would have gotten to this question anyhow. You would have started with the answer with what you just said. So there's this corridor map of Israel, and when you look at this map, you say that, God, if this will be achieved, at least to my intuition, we're home safe. This is the best we can do. If it could really be achieved. First of all, do you agree with that? And the second question, which is more important, given that, should the Nature and Parks Authority reduce the amount of investment, both time and money-wise, in single species management and focus on this issue? Okay? This is not an easy question, because basically, here's what I'm telling you.
You're talking about fellow deers, right? You're talking about
We're talking about reintroductions. We're talking about the tortoises. We're talking about what?
Vultures, fish.
Fish?
Yeah.
Okay.
Endemic.
Maybe even a few plants, right? But yeah, okay. But this is the question. This is the question. Do we actually stop? Or, well, Nature and Parks Authority can't stop completely. But should it really change its focus in a major way, away from the single species orientation and towards trying to achieve this landscape approach? I mean, you look mad. Yeah, because you're looking upset.
No. I'm thinking whether I should say what I want to say.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm just the moderator. You think I'm presenting some sort of opinion. I'm not.
No. It's nothing to do with you. Before doing that, it should save the money from all the educational work that it does.
From all the
educational work that it does. If the money is the issue, let them cancel all the educational work, save the money, and put it in both species and ecosystem management. On the organization level, it has nothing to do with Shkedi, but if this is the issue and Shaul has limited budget and wants to contribute to conservation, skip all the educational work, waste of time and money, and put it into species and ecosystem management. There are so many people.
I'm not going to ask Alon, because I know what Alon is going to say.
There are so many people doing education in one way or another in Israel. No one needs NPA to do it.
Okay, but that's an answer of a Ministry of Finance.
Yeah.
Now to the real issue. Would you? I didn't give you an option. You said that you were wanting it to say if you should say what you should have said. Well, you shouldn't. But more serious, really. Are you scared? Say no. Cancel the reintroductions. Stop them. Finish it.
No, why
No?
is
So
that?
what
No,
do you,
I think this
would that be a,
important.
is that a correct policy?
No. There is an option that both of them are okay. And I want to ensure resources to both.
Mhm.
That's my short response.
Okay.
Both of them
So
are important.
if they cancel the education programs,
You have money
there'll
for
be enough
both.
money for everybody.
Yeah, for these two activities, not everybody. You put two activities,
Mhm.
try to compare them, and I think both of them are very important to conservation.
Okay.
Species and ecosystem. You say we don't have money. So I offered you how to get the money.
Okay. Christian, yeah.
I think I need to disagree a little bit because it's obviously my role as a politician here on the panel. What I want to say is, looking at the whole setting of nature conservation, it starts somewhere with the basics, which is research, which is scientific evidence, and then it goes to providing or provision of sufficient space for biodiversity to keep it according to the international conventions, but also to the strategy, which is eventually set up once. Then it goes further to financing, it goes further to taking responsibility for the endangered species, for introducing, and it goes up in the end, if you allow me to describe maybe a bit a weird gradient of things, in the end it's the public, and it needs an awareness, and it needs to have a support from the public, because otherwise you will get lost. If you do only the ecosystem conservation, let's say, it will get lost, because afterwards people start saying, yeah, but we don't see the vultures, we don't see the fish, we don't see the turtles. We're not interested. We want to see the species which give you a holdback on the whole. So now comes the difficult question, where to draw the line. Obviously you're not a university, so on the research bit you can very well work as a data provider or as a monitoring scheme organizer to provide data for the research. And on the other side we have the NGOs who are there to take somehow up the feeling in the population, to bring that forward, to make a strong case for nature conservation. And maybe Avi, you're right, but I would never admit that you're right in that context. So it might be easy to separate the educational part, but I fear that then you're getting lost with all the nature conservation, and you have other duties, other very difficult challenges in your country, and only population growth to mention, that you will get lost your fundings in the end, because there won't be any holdback in the population.
Dan.
Thanks. I want to address the funding issue that Avi started. I agree that we have to do both ecosystems and species, but the places to look for the money or the funds or the resources, I think, is not within chopping all kinds of departments in the NPA, is rather through partnerships. The IDF, which controls around 60% of the country in terms of activity and land use, doesn't have a single ecologist. Maybe the NPA should cut down something that it's doing, but put an ecologist in the IDF, hoping that sometime the IDF is going to adopt this approach and fund it on its own. Likewise, the JNF, which controls, I think, 11% of the country, only recently started to fund its own ecologist. So, and it already has made quite a few changes in the organization. So maybe we should look on different organizations, trying to create partnerships with them through small budgets, but then you can have huge impacts on what's going on the management of the country.
Okay, Dan, before you answer, these guys are all chickens, okay? Because Shkedi, I don't think, has control of the education money.
I control everything.
He controls everything. Okay, then no problem. Is that correct? Shkedi?
No.
That's correct. So Shkedi has a bunch of money. You want to give him the education money, but that doesn't mean he's going to get it. Now what does he do? Does he put more
money of the invasive species?
Money of the invasive species. Okay, we'll get to that. Dan.
Sometimes the distinction is not clear. If you invest in vultures as a species that people can see, and it reflects then the health of the environment. Vultures play an important role in getting rid of debris, dead animals. Animals that linger on the landscape, as we know in Africa, cause disease. They fester, they get animals that are sick, so they have a negative impact on the functioning of the ecosystem because they ramify through to reduce so many of the population of herbivores. When they get poisoned, however, then the ecosystem is completely thrown out of whack, and what you end up doing is active management with sanitation. You take the food to try to feed the vultures to get them growing, but you need to then protect against the other animals that were doing well on the scavenge that then become a problem and kill chickens and goats and other things, the wolves, the feral dogs, the jackals. And so the ecosystem management sometimes is tied to the individual species. So if the species is charismatic, great, because the public cares about that. It's what they use as their bellwether. Is nature functioning? Do we see living animals around us? That's the hook for them to continue to invest. So we do want to have animals out there. Some of those animals can be utilized. You know, you've got deer, you can hunt deer, people like that. But the other aspect is when it comes to education, what did John Krebs say in his talk the other day? You have to be an honest broker. And one of the things about NGOs, no offense, is they're advocates. And they are going to push an agenda. And some are better at balanced presentations than others. And the government has a responsibility to mediate that discussion. And the education, if the nature reserves is going to do that, needs to be one in which there are the pros and cons, the full picture is given, because that's what the tax dollars are going to. And so that has to be an honest broker. Partnerships, networks are all important, but the idea of putting a trained scientist from MPA in the IDF, great idea, because then that will help get that ministry to understand what's going on. But we need to be able to understand how the linkages do tie to species and how outcomes need to be communicated to the public. And there are many publics on TV, school children, as well as other organizations that have their own mission. And so the connections have to be developed.
Tamam.
Well, there are many publics to educate, but I do disagree that the NPA needs to educate school children. Many organizations. Okay, yeah, I think it's incredibly important, but I think the NPA really needs to figure out, well, at least in the years that I was on the board, it was not clear where the educational missions ended, and there's a difference between dealing with politicians and the professional public and so on, and then going into schools. I will add something you mentioned about the Forest Service and the IDF taking an ecologist from the NPA. I think maybe the change in the Forest Service was reflected in the fact that they hired an ecologist, and then the ecologist has continued to make changes. And maybe what we need to do is push the IDF into understanding that it needs to hire an ecologist rather than produce someone from the outside. The IDF is incredibly wealthy, and it needs to understand this is to subsidize the IDF, and this is just putting in someone else who's not totally unrelated to their organizations, which is like a statement, this is not part of our responsibility, as opposed to the US Army, where every base commander is in charge if it's red-coated woodpeckers or any animal on base needs to answer by law if something happens. Yeah, that's, at the TNC is חברה להגנת הטבע, if you like, but it's not another a government agency. I think that would be a mistake. I agree with Avi. I don't think we have, or Dan, I don't think we have the privilege to choose between species and ecosystem management. I do think that ecosystem management is much more challenging at this point than species level management, which generally the INPA generally does well and understands the models, knows how to work with them, etc. And I think this is a great challenge now to managing at least the terrestrial systems of Israel. I will add, because we're all terrestrial people, I think, on this table, so I'll add that we need to think the marine realm very, very seriously now. You have very, very little power, academic power, professional power now in the sea, and I think this will probably need to, and even that was only hired in recent years, Loti, and it looks like this is going to need to change dramatically with the new challenges. So in case you were wondering what to do with your extra funds in the next few years, I think the sea will require much more of your attention, which is a huge challenge, but it's inescapable probably, so.
Okay, regretfully, we're out of time. We only covered a fraction of what you wanted to discuss.
May I say a word?
What?
May I say a word? I think very
Sure.
important.
Yeah.
Completely missed this.
We'll give a few minutes. Yossi, it's okay with you? A few minutes for any, if there's any things to be pointed. Before you say it, I want to say something so I won't forget. Right after this meeting, outside in the open area in the garden, there'll be cocktail and food to launch the Madad לבריאות הים. Offhand, I can't. The what? Ocean Health Index. So there'll be free food and drinks if nothing else brings you there. They'll probably be serving fish. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
The assumption here is Israel is small, full stop. But we miss the point that Israel is getting smaller every day because there is a population increase of 2%, which means that the strategy that we plan today may not work, may not operate in 20, 50, or 100 years. And I don't say more.
Okay.
I'm not going to live by
Yeah. Okay, it's too bad. Avi just raised an issue of alien species. Take the money from there. Point to think about. You should think about it when you decide.
I strongly disagree.
And I want to thank the panel. I want to thank our guests from abroad. I thank Christian and Dan for making this long trip. I want to thank Tamar Dayan. I always do this. Never mind. She got used to it. Tamar Dayan, Avi Pervolodski, and Alon Rothschild, all prominent figures in conservation in Israel.